Every time before a long ultramarathon, my heart is filled with fear. The distance always feels very intimidating, and the day after, I'm always in disbelief. I actually did it. I did my first 100k ultra on another continent. That is, if you count Europe as a continent. It was the SwissPeaks 100, which turned out to be an utter disaster. I ate too little, I was not familiar with the course, I did not know how to use or store my poles, which caused a lot of shaving. I ran out of food and water for hours. The alpine terrain was unexpectedly tough, and I finished in just over 25 hours. But 6 months later, I finished second in my local 100 miler, which sounds like a success, but was in fact a disaster in itself. But at least I finished in just under 30 hours, which was an acceptable time. There have been clearly some improvements. Every race comes with lessons. There must be something you did wrong and could improve upon. After SwissPeaks 100, my first race back in Hong Kong was the Coros 50. It was hot, very hot. I had cramps all over my body, even on my facial muscles. I simply could not move on many different occasions on the course. The lesson was, electrolytes are very important. I got myself some pills and started paying attention to that. I hope it'll work next summer. My second 100k was the TransLantau 100 by UTMB. For the stones, of course. The course was usual fare in Hong Kong. It started with some rain, but I started out as if it were a 50k. The result was a crazy slowdown towards the end after around 70k, and I started to feel some shaving in my groin area after 30k or so, but I did nothing and had no Vaseline on me. The last 20k was extremely painful torture. I got passed by so many people, but I finished in just under 18 hours. There were two lessons. First, you should run at a pace that you at least think you can maintain throughout the race. Don't start out too fast. Research has shown that the fastest runners are those who lose the least of their pace towards the end. Slow down is inevitable, but you should try to evade it as much as possible. The second lesson is loop yourself and bring along some cream to address any problem as soon as it arises. My third 100k was the North Face 100. The new thing for me was that it started at 10 PM in the evening. I had a day off on the day, but couldn't sleep at all, and I had 2 homemade pizzas with a lot of cheese to carb load. But I started to have a persistent case of stomach cramps at around 25k's into the race. Every step was painful, especially when you're running or on the downhills. At each checkpoint after that, I had serious thoughts about giving up, but every time I decided to keep going. The thinking was I could simply walk and finish under the final cutoff of 27 hours. Eventually, I finished in just over 19 hours. The race was really tough. The pain that came with every step was demoralizing. Luckily, I had some other runners to talk to for a big part of the second half of the race to bring my mind to other places. Otherwise, with the stomach cramps, I might not be able to finish. There are 4 lessons. First, do not have any marginally risky food choices before your race. Second, ultramarathons are supposed to be tough, and unexpected problems often arise, and they can come very early in the race. Third, unless taking another step is literally going to kill you, just hold on. You will get to the end, no matter how far away that might appear in the moment. Fourth, talk to people. No matter whether they are volunteers or other runners, it usually helps in one way or another. My fourth 100k was the Hong Kong 100. This was a big event with over 1,000 runners. The race course was also usual affairs in Hong Kong. It was the best organized ultramarathon I have ever taken part in. But at the beginning, there was some traffic jam, and I was also too timid to pass people on narrow trails. It was quite hot on race day. The sun was unrelenting. Some elite runners from mainland China seemed to have a lot of troubles with the heat as well. I was trying to pace myself, but as usual, I had many ups and downs along the way. I had a rather long rest in the middle with the drop bag, but other than that, I didn't feel I was in a disastrous situation at any point. I didn't entertain any thought of giving up. This alone was a big improvement. The race has all the big climbs towards the end. I eventually grinded out all those climbs and finished in just under 17 hours. This was not something to write home about, and my weak legs were completely trashed after 103 kilometers. But this was the first time I didn't experience any mental collapse in a 100k ultra. Even though the Hong Kong 100 for me was a case of successful implementation on race day, there were still a lot of things I could have done better. Pacing, eating, electrolyte management, and so on. It is always easy to learn a lesson on a conceptual level, but a big gap exists between what you have in mind and what you actually do in reality. My next big challenge then was the Victoria 162, which was a 100-miler, the one and only such distance event in Hong Kong this year, I think. It's a rather unusual 100-miler because you have to take public transportation in between different sections. There are 3 sections. First, 57k on Lantau Island, the next 83k in the New Territories and Kowloon, and the last 25k on Hong Kong Island. The good thing about this is you are forced to take a breather on those 2 transits. The Hong Kongers as they are, even though they might recognize that you are kind of exhausted, they will hold on to their precious seats in the metro. As Victoria 162 was also a race that starts at night, I signed myself up for another race that starts at night 2 weeks before that as some kind of a practice. This was the 9 Dragons 50 miles. I finished the whole thing without a lot of issues, but still with a lot of grinding towards the end in just under 12.5 hours. And I didn't have any serious stomach issue. But this 50 miler had a lot of tarmac, over half of the distance I would say, which was very tough on my legs, so much so that I could only limp back home afterwards. The Victoria Run 62 unfortunately took place on a very cold night. It was raining as well. The stairs, made of irregularly shaped stones with smooth surfaces that are commonplace in Hong Kong, became extremely slippery. Basically, every runner I met had a fall on the downhill from the Lantau peak. My strategy in this race was simple. Go slow and constantly remind myself that the race really starts after 100 kilometers. It's helpful that there were not a lot of runners in the race. The total number of people I ran across after the first 10k was exactly 2. So not too much competitive spirit to speak of, which might have been a gift in disguise. But I still had a lot of issues. First, the energy drink in the race was Gatorade, which I had never experimented with before. It seemed to have triggered my acid reflux, to which I knew I was prone, but I never had heartburn during a race. And even after I stopped taking the Gatorade from the aid stations, almost any solid food or any bumpy ride on the trail would trigger my heartburn. So basically, I had to deal with this issue for over 25 hours, almost non-stop. I could not eat a lot, and my solution was to refill half a liter of Coke at every aid station as my main calorie intake. Needless to say, it led to serious flavor fatigue. My second solution is to relieve my heartburn with plain water. So I was drinking a lot of water, like 1 liter or so per hour. I tried to compensate with electrolytes pills, but I still pee a lot and felt constantly very thirsty. I still don't know what happened. The second thing was I had an upset stomach from 50k to 70k or so. I went to the toilets when they were available, but at some points the toilet was 3-4 kilometers away, and I simply couldn't muster the strength to hold it. Pooing in the bushes became inevitable. It was my first time being so primitive. I guess it is a necessary part of an ultra running experience. Luckily, I always bring wet wipes with me. The third thing was blisters. I had never had blisters before. At the aid station where I could get my drop bag, I didn't change socks or shoes because everything seemed fine at the time. But 30 minutes later, my toes started to hurt. I didn't even know it was blisters. I just stopped and took off my socks and put them on again. Of course, it didn't help. And for the next 45k, I was basically struggling with my physical and mental fatigue, my acid reflux or heartburn, and the pain on my toes. At 110k or so, my pace started to slow down dramatically. Uphill was okay, running became very hard. Going down hills was torture. At this point, I knew I passed the runner who was the second at around 100k, so I was psychologically prepared to be caught up by him the whole time. But he never appeared. I guess if you are suffering, so is everybody else. The last 25k on Hong Kong Island was supposed to be the easy bit, but I was limping along, couldn't walk properly, let alone running. I spent half an hour trying to readjust my socks, and it was at this point I realized I had some blisters on my toes, which I had no idea how to deal with. I simply put some band-aids on them, which was not very helpful. At this point, I had really serious thought of giving up. The idea of limping in the dark for another 25k was very intimidating, but eventually I decided to keep going, reminding myself of the fact that I could walk to the finish line well under the cutoff time. After climbing some long stairs and limping for a bit, I experimented with some emphatic heel striking style of running, which was very painful on my heels and my Achilles heels, but minimized the pain from the blisters. So I kept running in this bizarre way whenever I could, albeit very slowly. At the second aid station on Hong Kong Island, a very helpful volunteer popped one of the blisters for me, which made the pain much more tolerable. But then another 20 minutes went by at the aid station, and the thought of being caught up by another runner kept me going. Sometimes competitive spirit helps. After this point, I was still moving forward, but my energy level was very low. I couldn't eat much because of my heartburn, and I couldn't stand another sip of Coca-Cola. To make things worse, the rest of the course was almost all tarmac. This had to become entirely a mental game. In the end, I finished the second, but it didn't feel like a win. In any case, this finish, despite all the issues that came up along the way, was a confidence boost. My next big ultra will be the UTMF, or the Mount Fuji 100 miler, that takes place in April. The race does not allow poles. At this Victoria 162, I didn't use any poles and still managed to finish the race with close to 8,000 meters of total elevation. This at least proved that I could go the distance without poles. Looking back at the last 6 months as someone who doesn't have any structured training plan, I think I have improved quite a lot. I guess at the end of the day, ultra running is about keep going and keeping an open mind to endure and try to solve any problems that inevitably come up during a race. I don't have any big insight on conclusion here, but I hope anyone still watching at this point would find my experience marginally helpful.